So once again, welcome to everybody on the webinar today, which is being presented through the Data Protection Network and with us at Bristows. I'm Robert Bond and I'm a partner in the Data Protection team. I'm going to introduce our panel in a moment, but the reason that we decided to look at this topic, protecting children's privacy online, the legal and ethical responsibilities, was that a lot of the organizations we know are registered today and that we work with as members of the Data Protection Network are challenged by a number of issues around the differing ages for children, from a privacy to view, the requirements of GDPR to have age-appropriate notices and so on, the pressure on information society service providers, the risk that actually the need to comply from a children's perspective with protection may go beyond traditional information society service provider. And we also thought it was appropriate talk about this in the light of the work that the ICO has been doing to produce an age-appropriate design code. And I'm going to, in a minute, just bring out a few quotes from Elizabeth Denham's recent blog about this, highlight the key issues around the age-appropriate design, and then put questions which we have received to our panel, and then there will not be much from me. I hope it's all going from our panelists. And please do send questions in using the question box as we go along, take them as appropriate or push them to the end. Please note that the webinar will be recorded and available for download from our website and from the Data Protection Network in a few days' time after this webinar has finished. We aim to finish about an hour from the time we started, so that'll probably be about 5:05. So you've seen my bio there, and I wanted to move on to our next panelist, Roberto Calizzi, who I've had the pleasure to work with and indeed do webinars with in the past, and who is with Turner, where he's responsible for data protection. Roberto has very kindly agreed to give some of his own views about these issues, not necessarily those of Turner. And we're very grateful to have somebody from the business that certainly aims its product at children as well as adults. And then our next member of the panel is Debbie McElhill, who is a senior associate with Opt4, an active member of and indeed founders of the Data Protection Network. Debbie has been doing a lot of consulting in this area, particularly with marketing teams and design teams and so on. So we're very grateful to have Debbie on. And then the next panelist is Professor Andy Phippen from Plymouth University. Again, I've had the pleasure and the fun of working with Andy for well over 2 years on children's privacy issues. At the time, Andy was chairman of the trustees of Southwest Grid for Learning, which in turn runs the UK Safer Internet Centre. He regularly appears on BBC and other programs talking about the issues of children and their understanding or otherwise of privacy and whether or not they bother with privacy statements. And then finally, we have Boris Radanovic from the Southwest Grid for Learning, who is from Croatia and is on loan to the Safer Internet Centre in the UK here. I should mention that Boris and Andy are both dialing in from the West Country. And so I've asked them if they can jump in when they want to, but otherwise be on mute like everybody else as we go through. So just before we get to the next session of questions, one of the things that is instrumental now in the focus on children's online privacy is ISO's age-appropriate design code, which she has been working on with industry for some while. I suspect many of us who are involved in this webinar have read the code, if not responded to the code, and I noticed there are big variation of organizations responded to the code, from information society service providers to children's charities to publishers in the digital media to those in the social media and so on. In her recent blog, Elizabeth said, online services play an ever-growing part in our children's lives, but the internet was not designed for children. Our code aims not to protect children from the digital world, but instead to protect them within it. She also goes on in the blog that she recently put out to remind us that GDPR sets how data can be used and the importance of protecting children. And she believes that it will make the requirements clearer, help developers to develop more appropriate products and services. She equally says, as you can see, that this will bring challenges for the tech, the e-gaming and the interactive entertainment sectors, and we'll no doubt touch on these challenges. I also have not put this in the slide, but I am just leave you with her penultimate sentence in the blog, which is, there is no room for companies who decide children's privacy is a problem that's simply too hard to solve. So doing nothing is not an option. What we're here today to do is to try and talk about the so what and the how to type issues. So just moving on, here are the 16 standards that the code sets out. Now, I'm not going to go through these for you, but I leave them there for just a moment, because now what I wanted to do was to, and by all means, you'll be able to come back to these slides when you download, so no need to scribble notes immediately, but let's move to the questions, because we've got about 45 minutes and quite a lot to get through. And I'm going to try and take these in the order that we've put up here. And so I'm going to ask Andy if he can, and then perhaps Boris, talk about the first question here. And before I turn to you, Andy, you and I know full well that when we were working together on the Eye in Online project in 2008, where we were going into schools and talking to children between 16 and 18, it never even occurred to us that we might a few years later be talking to children of 8 to 12. There was clearly no, in my view, understanding from those that we were talking to in schools about what privacy notices were. But what do you think, with the research you're doing now, Andy, about children's awareness? Are they more aware now than they were 5 years ago, 10 years ago?
Thanks, Robert, and hello, everyone. I think you might be somewhat disappointed, but not too surprised to hear me say that I don't really think things are moving forward as far as privacy awareness is concerned. You know, I spend a lot of time talking to young people, and most of them don't really register that privacy is an issue they need to tackle. Most young people are of the view that you know, their information is worthless and no one's interested in what they've got to say. However, if you flip it round and then say, "Can I have a look at your mobile phone?" then they go, "No, absolutely not. That's mine. It's private." So that's an interesting reflection. But I think we're going to pick up on this later, I think, as well. But I'd also suggest that there is an absolute dearth of quality teaching in this area. While there are some statutory requirements to cover online safety now, what they actually cover is, not particularly well defined, and I think privacy does slip through the gaps a great deal. So I really don't think, given it is over 10 years ago since we did the Iron Online stuff, I really haven't seen much improvement in young people's awareness, and therefore obviously they're not really going to be engaging with the privacy notice as something they need to do.
Okay, and Boris, what are your thoughts?
Yes, thank you, and hello to everybody. Thank you for the invitation. Well, if I said that I agree with Andy, that will be it. So I have to obligatory disagree with him. No, I do not disagree with him entirely, but I do think that the whole, if I can call it science, I mean, internet is only 30 years old, 31 in a couple of months. The online safety, the biggest changes in online safety happened in the last 15 years, maybe the scientific approach to it in the last 5 years or 10 years by Andy and similar professors all around the world. So I do think there is, I'm a bit more hopeful than Andy. I do think there's a positive change, but I do not think that children consider privacy in the way that we consider privacy. If you look at it online, practically privacy is more or less dead. We do post everything and we do share everything about us. So what levels of privacy and how they consider privacy in 2019 is an interesting question, and it could be researched. But I do think with development of a lot of services they take for granted and some of the privacy controls, I'm staying hopeful that some of those changes will make them more privacy aware in the future, and they will respect and either ask or demand bigger levels of their own privacy.
Okay, thank you. And I'm just looking at Debbie or Roberto. Okay, and I'm just going to throw this back at you, Andy, because I've been talking to parents, just parents in our own law firm who have children who are saying, well, I don't know, my children seem to be much more aware now, and indeed have, taken down their whatever account it may be because of what they read in the media. Is that not true, that they genuinely are more savvy? If I was to take a cynical view, and heaven forbid I take a cynical view, I might suggest they're very good at delivering the online safety messages to stakeholders in their safeguarding. So yeah, they'll tell their parents that privacy is important. However, they'll willingly share their social media passwords and logins and similar with prospective partners, boyfriends, girlfriends, friends. The behaviours they exhibit do not necessarily reflect the fact about what they will sometimes tell us. And I think that's one thing that very starkly stands out a great deal, is that they will deliver the online safety messages because they've had them drummed into them at school. However, practice is somewhat different. Okay, and so actually just following on from that very quickly, is the problem also with the parents then, if they're gullible enough to believe what they're told?
Well, yeah, I mean, you've got an interesting juxtaposition now, because there's a whole range of parents who will happily remove their child's privacy in order to reassure themselves that they'll safe. So you have parents who will track children, who will monitor their social media communications, who will monitor their mobile phone usage, which hardly gives a message to children that they have a right to privacy, I would suggest.
Okay. And then, again, sorry to just carry on with you, Andy, but the second question dovetails into this. And again, you and I were involved in research probably in 2010, 11 and 12 about children's understanding of privacy policies or privacy notices. And I seem to remember that something like 62% of about 4,000 children we researched never bothered reading the policy, and of the 30 some odd that read it, they didn't understand it. Where do you think we are today?
I think we're probably in about the same place, to be honest with you. I mean, privacy notices generally aren't written in a child-friendly way, and they are a barrier to getting to the service. So whether that's social media or whether it's a gaming platform or whatever, so they will do what they can to get past these things as quickly as possible, which is generally just to click, yeah, I've read it, I've agreed it, now can I get to my game, please? I don't think there's massive amounts of education raising the fact that, you know, you have rights, and if you read these, you might understand what your rights are in the case of a breach or in case of something going wrong. I just don't think there's the conversation we're having with children.
And with the work, Boris, that you know you're doing in schools, are you finding that the message is getting across about the need for children to work with the privacy notice, the consent mechanisms, to the extent it applies to them?
Well, I often quote the text that we put, yes, I have read the terms and service or agreements or privacy notices, is the biggest lie of the 21st century. And just to connect it with your prior question about parents, I think we are finding ourselves in a situation that can be easily compared if a non-driving parent is trying to teach their child how to drive. That situation will never help in real life. And now we're expecting parents of 20, 30, maybe 35 to educate children on digital safety and how to be safe online, what to do, what is your privacy, when nobody gave them the rule book. Nobody showed them the basic principles of how to behave online, and they are the first ones not being a digitally responsible parent or role model in the digital space. So I definitely think there's much more work need to be done with parents, especially with that group of people, just to educate and elevate their knowledge about online safety. Connecting that to the messages, I have to say we are really, I'm trying to find an English word not to sound too rude, but we are outdated with the advices that we are giving children in 2019. Just beginning with, do not share your private information online, and the first thing you do when you open up a Facebook profile is your name, surname, profile picture, group of friends, group of family, mobile phone number, and email. Like, that's the step number one. So that advice in that essence doesn't work. Or the advice that you do not meet people that you meet online, you don't meet in real life. Yeah, but mom uses Tinder, Badoo, or any other dating app on Fridays and Saturdays to meet strangers online and then go meet them in person. Some of these advices are from like early 2000s or even 1990s. And we need to rethink how we even deliver that, number one, but then what kind of messages are we giving to children in today's world? But while I agree completely with Andy, they can recite back much of that advice. And I always, in every session with children, ask them, what would you do if you encounter any challenges online harms? They sing in unison. We will talk to our mom and dad, and they just ask a sub question like, would you really? And then all of them, they say no. So we have to rethink and reshape how we deliver and what kind of messages we deliver, because just because they had an online safety session, just because they're being told some of these advices, I'm not sure we are getting through to them in this day and age with some advices that we haven't evolved in the last 15, 20 years of online safety.
Okay, so when we're looking at this from an in-house point of view or advising, we're already, notwithstanding the good intent of the regulator and indeed the good intent of the compliance team, facing a challenge because we are not preaching to the converted. So I'm looking at Roberto here. Is it reasonable to create policies that are tailored to children of different age groups? How does business get the message across and try to comply?
Yeah, I mean,
faced with what's heard.
Yeah, thanks, Robert, for this question. I mean, we are known for a long time that we needed to create policies which are clearer than the standard policies for children. This is a GDPR requirement. Also, the ICO has always insisted on this point. But what this code does is actually creating very narrow age groups, 0 to 5, 6 to 9, 10 to 12, 13 to 16, 16 to 17, which I'm not sure this age groups so narrow really reflect the ability of each individual, the interest of each individual. And the code is actually quite prescriptive as well about what we need to include in the policies, with text, supporting video messages, audio message, maybe even graphics depending on the age of the child, and then also some other communication for the parents. And just put yourself in the shoes of a provider that as a tag, sports websites, the target age is from 6 to 25. I mean, So it's the requirement that they need to provide as many policies as these age groups, because really that would be a massive undertaking and in itself. But then technologically, there's another tricky part, because be able to know who is your public at a certain time, a certain moment in time, and then deliver the privacy policy for that public and not for another type of public. So it's very tricky. I guess from what I read on the ICO website and their responses to the consultation, they seem to be open to self-certification. So they kind of moving a bit away from the robust age gating, but that still presents such a huge challenges especially for smaller organizations, but even from the big ones. So yeah, so there's quite a lot on there.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I agree with Roberto. It is a challenge for organisations. I mean, it's good practice and it's good customer practice to tailor your message to your audience. So I guess, you know, there will be organisations will be doing that anyway, or attempting to do that anyway. But I do see where you're coming from with the very prescriptive levels. You know, the age categories that are actually in the code, and I just wonder whether actually they'll have listened to some of the feedback at the ICO and come out with perhaps a less prescriptive approach. It'd be interesting to see.
Yeah, and then again, we are faced with the instant gratification requirement that to the extent a child is capable of saying yes or no, they're generally going to click the whatever button because they want it. And I think that's frustrating. And I know we come to the why do we not have a highway code of the digital world like we have for road safety and food labeling and so on. But our next question is very much for Boris. So the question is, how does 360 and data 360 work in schools? Perhaps you could explain, Boris, what Southwest Grid for Learning has been doing in this area and how it's been working with a long-term view to getting some help from the ICO on other stuff?
Yes, thank you for the question. So first of all, to all of the listeners here who are listening to the webinar, if you're in a school and currently not using 360 Safe tool, you should be. So the web address is pretty simple, 360safe.org.uk. So 360 Safe is a self-review online safety policy tool. It helps school shape their online safety policies. It helps school see what practices they need to be putting in place to protect children in the online and digital space. And the tool itself empowers schools to walk through each aspect of online safety. And when we absolutely understand that there are many aspects that the school maybe not even recognizes real people in the school, from policy and leadership, from infrastructure, from education, from standards and inspection. And in the end, the tool itself, it doesn't give only the ability to self-review or to check the standards. It also gives the possibility of accreditation and a process for identifying strengths and weaknesses, and then even better, how to then implement changes and how to enhance those levels so those weaknesses would become strengths. It's really a powerful tool, and I think in the last 10 years, November this year, there will be the 10th year that the 360 Safe tool is in use. And Professor Andy has, for the last years, been analyzing this data for more than 13,000 schools in 2018 to see, let's say, a yearly, if I dare to say, a state of the nation report on online safety of more than 13,000 schools. What are the strengths? What are the weaknesses of all of that data joined together? And the tool itself kind of engages the entire school community in an excellent way to move forward in a comprehensive but also easy way to use. It gives advices and saves a lot of time. So in any of your listeners, just go visit 360safe.org.uk, the website where you can apply for this free self-review tool and just start on your journey. And one of the interesting things maybe from the report from 2018, and I will not go too deep into that. I will leave Professor Andy who analyzed most of these details, that there was no staff training in 43% of the schools. That's a really terrifying statistics, that in the biggest advancement in society, which is the internet and digital connection, in 43% of schools haven't felt the need or had the capacity or money or funding to invest in staff training. When the teachers are the ones who can first recognize some basic signs, either of cyberbullying or bullying, or signs of any online harms being developed amongst children. And no data protection was found in 30% of the schools. So the schools which have the most valuable data in the world, and that's the data of a child, 30% of them have no data protection. And some of the weaknesses there, of course, are in staff training or online safety groups, and unfortunately some others. But on the other side, there are strengths that the schools that are using the tools have been shown, and that's filtering and monitoring. That's the scope of policy and the policy development. We as adults, we're really good at writing. We like to write stuff, stick it in a drawer, and then nobody understands that 48 pages of policy, that the only person who understands it is the person who wrote it. So there's much more that we can do in understanding online safety and implementing that in schools. And if you're only starting your online safety voyage, and it is a voyage, it's sometimes a year or 2 years process, 360 Safe, the online safety self-review tool, is a brilliant start into all schools out there. And as well, there is a company version, the online Compass version, so it can be used to other organizations, not only in schools. So please just feel free to reach out to SWGFL or 360 Safe tool and just begin the process. And I think Andy can comment on other developments in the last couple of years that happened for the 360 Safe.
Yeah, and thank you. And Andy, as Boris was talking, I know this is sort of extending the child to the big child, but doesn't the same challenge also occur in the higher educational sector? And I think you and Professor Emma Bond have done some work on these issues for students.
Yeah, we're doing quite a lot of work at the moment looking at the higher education space, and I think if we have concerns on schools, we have greater concerns on higher education spaces. I mean, so schools at least have a statutory responsibility to both educate students and also look after them while they're there, where universities don't have that. The argument being that they're adults, so they don't have to worry about it. Now, obviously, the Social Care Act and the definition of a vulnerable adult would suggest different, but those are the conversations we're having at the moment. But I think there's another side to the 360 tool. I mean, Boris has sort of quoted some statistics, and it demonstrates that in the school sector, even though there is statutory requirement that governors ensure staff are trained and staff deliver effective education. You know, as Boris was saying, 40% of staff had no training, around 50% of governors had no training. So all the stakeholders in this space are coming at it from a fairly low knowledge base. But I think that the flip side of what the tool is if you like a due diligence tool for the organisation. They have a statutory requirement to demonstrate that they have engaged with online safety, and the tool provides them with the opportunity to demonstrate that. And I think there's some interesting parallels there looking at where you go forward with the code, because what you're not going to be able to do as an organisation is go, we can guarantee that no child below the age of X will be able to engage with our services. However, what you can do is demonstrate, or you can attempt to do, is demonstrate that you have actually gone through a process of understanding how you might put restrictions in place and how you might communicate those. And I think there's certainly lessons to be learned there from the education sector.
Thank you. And while you've been talking, we've had a couple of questions in. One, can we provide a link to 360? And we'll do that after the webinar's finished. And a good question that's come in about the challenges of differing age restrictions for consent for data protection, but we've had several of those, and it sort of links to one of the other questions. So to James, I'll come back to you on that in a minute. I think one of the other issues that we found when we were looking at the code, and I'm looking here at Debbie because you particularly flagged this, is the risk that information service society providers is so widely drawn, it's going to hoover up people who don't anticipate that that's what they do. Do you want to expand on that one?
Yeah, thanks, Robert. I mean, the challenge really is that as an organisation, you sort of caught by the code unless you can prove you are not. So, you know, even if you are providing a service that's aimed at adults, you must be able to demonstrate, you know, specific documented evidence that actually children are not accessing your service.
So not the we are not, if you are 18, do not use the, or yeah,
that's not.
It's got to be much more. Yeah.
Yes, that's not going to cut it. And whilst the code isn't prescriptive on how to do that, it does make some suggestions. So some things like market research, actually referring to current evidence and user behaviour, and also you know, the user base for existing services. But there's an irony, I think, in that in itself, because standard 11 of the code says turn profiling off by default where children are concerned. So, you know, how do organisations actually come up with this body of evidence that you know, is going to be sufficient proof that under 18s aren't accessing the service? I think it is a challenge.
Roberto?
Yes. Well, when I looked at the definition of internet society service, information society service. I mean, obviously the definition is the usual one that we are familiar with. It talks about any service normally provided for remuneration at a distance by electronic means and at the individual request of a recipient of services. So that's we had this definition for a long time. It's not new, but the ICO gave some practical examples, which are obviously they make sense, but they make you think. Because yeah, not only we end up including services which are not necessarily directed at children, which simply cannot prove that they are not directed at children, but we also include services which are we never really thought about before. I mean, they gave examples like, okay, no doubt about the provider of online products or services, apps and websites, but then obviously they talk about news and education websites, coded by the code and the standards, messaging services, then streaming services, which are actually that can be obviously needs to be on-demand streaming services, not a linear feed like a broadcast service, like with a scheduled time. And then it goes on and talks about connected toys or devices with or without screen. And then there's an actual a whole section of the code when the ICO explains what they mean. I mean, they mean things like talking teddies with a microphone, recording messages to personalize the answers. So they talk about fitness bands, which record the physical activity, interactive speaker devices, which provide services via voice recognition service. Obviously, not what they're talking about here, but without naming them. And that kind of brings into play all sorts of obligations that I think to date the company behind these tools really didn't address. Like they need to clarify who is processing the information that then is collected, what they do when there are multiple users of different ages, how do they address that, and how they use the data that then is collected, and then they need to try as a default have stop a passive recording, like a microphone always listening, so that can learn the voice of the person. So these are things which I think they are not unreasonable, but they make you wonder. Yeah, this is almost like you need to think: am I caught by the code? And if you really need to think hard whether you are or you're not, because you're most likely caught than you're not, and especially because the burden of proof is so high, the bar is so high, and proving that the site is not likely to be accessed by children. Think about a news website, and the children is anyone under 18. I mean, a news website is going to be accessed by teenagers because they want to, sometimes it's part of the schoolwork. So that's
yes. So I'm one of the challenges I can see is that you either go to the one extreme which is to say nobody ever can access our website who is a child, or you've got to design the entire process so that everybody's treated like a child. And I've actually, we've got that as the next question. And again, well, I'm actually going to ask Andy if he's got thoughts about what we've just heard, and is that the risk that we'll end up with the lowest common denominator approach?
I certainly think there is a risk, because if accountability lies at your door, you're going to do what you can to demonstrate that you've tried to avoid young people accessing the site. I also think, I think we might pick up on this later, that there are some fairly serious technical challenges around age verification that sometimes I think those defining the legislation don't sort of reflect on. I mean, we only need look at the Digital Economy Act and access to pornographic services and the challenges that's faced in the fact it's still not implemented. So there's only so much you can expect an organisation to do, because there are some serious challenges there in how you might implement it. And I think you can end up in a situation where you kind of go, all right, well, we'll just do this for everybody, rather than having nuance in the site.
Okay, yeah, Roberto.
Yeah, I mean, I want to add to this. It's like the ICO confirmed in the response to the consultation that took place on the code that they ideally would like to see as default setting the child-friendly ones, and then and relying on self-declaration to then adapt the settings to the service. So that's pretty much with the ICO standard. But also, I want to emphasize about the comment about being treated as a child. The code sometimes has not been entirely clear about certain elements, and we need to be absolutely clear that we are talking about protection of data, not about content, because all the organizations out there providing services, or at least most of them, are regulated by, for example, by the CAP code, and which is enforced by ASA. The Advertising Standard Authority, or if you're a broadcaster, you need to comply with the media, the Audiovisual Media Directive, which is then enforced by Ofcom. So the content is already regulated in a number of ways. So we just need to make sure that we're talking about data, and then there is not, we don't cross the line from data to content.
Can I just pick up on that? I think that's a really good point. I mean, in the safeguarding world, there is certainly a belief among numerous stakeholders that the 13 age verification thing for social media sites is entirely down to safeguarding. They don't actually recognise it, advertising regulation. I think we really need to be careful to look at this purely from a data consent perspective, rather than it bleeding into safeguarding, because that would be a very different kettle of fish. And I think you're absolutely right. This is about processing of data, not what content they can access. I think it's a really good point to make.
Yeah, although, Andy, I guess when you're looking at this from a compliance perspective, and remember we've got the word ethical in here as well, I think it's difficult to not look at the other aspects around, particularly picking up on what the ICO says. This is not about preventing children accessing online. It's about managing the way in which they experience the online. And yes, some of that is personal data, but some of that bounces into human rights and safety and a whole load of other issues. I'm looking at, we've got a question that came in about the territorial scope. What I wonder is the ICO thinking or not thinking, or businesses thinking or not thinking, where they are not physically in the UK or not even in Europe, but pushing their products here. They must be caught by this. They're caught by GDPR, aren't they?
Yeah, I think the intention of the code is to catch these providers. I mean, they use the same definition, the same territorial scope as the UK Data Protection Act. So if you are based in the UK, you're caught. if you have if the services are provided in the context of an establishment based in the UK, you're caught. At the same time, if you are a provider outside, currently outside the EEA, but presumably after Brexit outside the UK, and you target your service to individuals in the UK, or you monitor the behavior to individuals in the UK, and these services are likely to be accessed by children, then you are caught as well. So it's very wide. I mean, the ICO, and in the comments to the consultation, they acknowledge that worldwide services can be a real challenge, because you end up having like a global standard starting from here, and the organization may find this quite maybe uncomfortable.
So moving on to questions that we've had in while we've been talking, particularly on age itself and the definition of the child, coupled with the question we've got here, which is age actually the right measurements? And I think here we're going from not what the law says, but what we feel is appropriate. We've had a couple of questions saying, so how on earth is business supposed to approach this when, from a data protection point of view, we have each member state interpreting what is a child and below, with the UK doing 13, with some countries at 16, with some at 15, with some at 14. Given that you have to accept this is multi-jurisdictional in the way that we send out our services and so on, how do you decide on where you go? Do you just do 16? We know some social media companies are doing, or, as has been suggested, particularly in the consultation, should in fact the measurement be more cognitive, the ability to understand? Roberto was talking about age brackets of 5 to 7 or 10 to 12, etc. And people are better at different ages. Everybody differs where they are and when they understand. I mean, Roberto, what do you think? What's the right way of measuring the point at which somebody is able to understand, etc.?
I mean, I think here we need to be led by what the legislators say. I mean, the age for digital consent is 13, and in other territories is 16. 16 is the default position for GDPR. And I think it reflects cultural expectations as well. So what I want to say is, like, this is about consent when the legal basis is consent, but the legal basis for processing data does not have to be consent, and in fact, in most cases, is something else. So this is very a limited instance where the question, this becomes relevant.
And then you've got the age at which a minor can contract.
Yeah,
we'd say, well, 16. But Andy, I know offline we talked about this. What are your thoughts here?
I mean, my thought would be to err on the side of caution. Age verification is a challenge anyway. I mean, 18 is a big enough challenge, so 13, 15, 14, I'd really suggest that organisations, to err on the side of caution and just, take the WhatsApp approach or something, go right within the EU territories, it's 16, and don't present these additional headaches. But I think going back to your point about whether age is the right measure, I doubt it is. However, anything else would be even more difficult to measure and to be able to verify. So if you're talking about cognitive ability or something, then that's going to be a real challenge. But yeah, absolutely, one 13-year-old will be very clear in understanding a privacy policy where another one will not have a clue. So at best, it's a crude measure.
Yeah, and Boris, any comments?
I think I agree completely with Andy. It's the best measuring stick we have, and it's not the perfect one, definitely. And I think that any company thinking of doing work and doing business in cross-national borders should think more about making their services more age appropriate or child appropriate and child safe. But in the end, that question will still remain in the air. I don't think we will help anybody answer it. But I'll agree with Andy. Just stay on the year of caution and just have a singular approach which kind of covers all the bases.
Okay, so we've got another question about how do we engage children, and again, a number of years ago, Andy knows on Data Protection Day, we went into schools, we gave, I think, a simplified SpongeBob SquarePants privacy notice to children and said, create something that you would understand. And we got a lot of visuals back. And I know Roberto already talked about cartoons, about visuals, icons, and so on. Aren't we at risk here of taking an adult approach and forgetting that we need to talk to the very people we're trying to protect here? What do you think? And I'm going to put this to Boris first of all, because you're dealing with this in schools, etc.
Well, I'm always amazed how different or how creative and how simple sometimes and pure children think about some complex issue that we consider complex. So definitely, and it's always hard. I'm usually the youngest person in all of these discussions, and I'm the youngest person in stakeholder groups from governments to industry. And when you just say youth involvement or child involvement, it kind of raises the hair on back of most of the people's necks. I don't know why. And I do truly think that getting a perspective from a child on something that you design so complex or even for a child to protect them is an essential part, or should be an essential part of that process. There's many ways and many areas that can be done, which is beneficial for the child with the consent of the parents, and also like there's a whole procedure to it. But if you do want to create things for the future, or things that could stand the test of time and have a child-centric approach to it, which any service in the world could be used by a child, if we are being completely honest, I think that should be mandatory for any company that is trying to be socially responsible in this day and age in doing business, because that social sensitivity, especially to those groups that we should all take more responsibility towards to protect and to educate, should be a part of our design process. That's my way of thinking. I'm not sure what other people think.
Okay, and Andy, just before you, Roberto wants to jump in here.
Yes. Okay, that's exactly the position of the code and the ICO. But what I would like to say about that is obviously the overarching principle here is accountability of organizations. So they should know when they need to involve children. Consider that the scope of the code is not just for services directed at children, but also for services which are likely to be accessed by children. Potentially, you are asking every organization to conduct a DPIA for every service they provide, which may have even 1% of children on it. So I think that's and that kind of tips the balance against the principle of accountability, in my opinion, because having as a mandatory requirement to have children to be interviewed and to be considered each time is possibly an incredible high burden and possibly a little bit disproportionate if your service is not directed at children specifically.
Mm-hmm. And again, just jumping back to you, Andy, your thoughts about involving, children in the process.
I think I certainly agree with Boris that young people are generally the people outside of the stakeholder discussion of this sort of thing. I co-authored something with my son that ended up in Entertainment Law Review, I think, a while ago, where he was basically saying there seems to be an awful lot of stuff here sought up by lots of adults who aren't speaking to young people. I don't think it's a case of companies having to have young people focus groups or anything like that, but I do think there's a role for young people to play as a broader macro level, maybe with the Information Commissioner, on what works. I mean, if you look at the gaming sector, they've kind of got it better because the PEGI ratings are fairly well established and young people engage with them and they understand them. So it demonstrates that, icon-based approaches do work. So I think there's probably some work to do with young people at that level rather than expecting every company have their young person's focus group that they run anything past.
Okay, and Debbie?
Yeah, just to add to that, I think that it's really important for organisations to acknowledge that this is a commercial challenge. It's about addressing you and knowing your audience, and it's not something to sit just with the compliance team. So, you know, it's sort of a boardroom, you know, are we addressing our audience in the language that's going to work? And it's a consideration for everybody.
And I remember that when some of the first iterations of GDPR came out, and there was specific focus on children's privacy there was one version where they came up with icons.
Yes.
From a member of the European Parliament had a good go, and I seem to remember that your data will be stored was a 5-inch floppy disk, which, you know, nobody would remember what a 5-inch floppy was. And I think that's going to be part of the problem if we don't involve the very audience we're trying to aim it at, though I agree that not every board needs to have a child advisor on it. I'm going to just twist the last two questions round, and we have another one. So we've got an implementation period suggested in the code. So looking at, do we think the implementation period the ICO is looking at is fair?
3 months is fairly short, especially all that organizations require to implement, and presumably a lot of work will have been done by to comply with that. The bar here is very high, and so hopefully it's not like 12 months.
Yeah, and I mean, I refer to this. Sorry, was that? The need to do things like DPIAs.
Yes.
I think, you know, there's stuff you cannot do nothing.
Yeah.
That's the message.
Yeah.
I got a question, and this is, let's put it to Andy if you're there. So what do we think about the lack of training driven by government?
I'm a fairly vocal critic of that sort of thing. It's all very well casting judgments and saying do this, but when you have nothing from the education space that actually helps build on this, because bearing in mind we're looking way into the future here. We're not thinking about revisiting this in 5 years' time. I think there's a great deal of irresponsibility. I mean, I have spent quite a lot of time in the last 3 or 4 years saying, can we stop just pointing the finger at industry and going do more, and actually understand that, you know, something as simple as passing legislation that trained specialists deliver this sort of thing in schools would make such a difference. But the view seems to be, oh, it's technology, therefore the tech sector can sort it out, which, you know, is quite problematic. I should say, I think the code's quite progressive for a legislative document, especially compared to something like the Online Harms White Paper. But I don't think it points the finger back at government or gets government to reflect enough on this sort of thing.
Okay, and Boris, any thoughts?
I do have to apologize. I had some connection issues, so I didn't quite hear the comment from Andy. But I hope the question was about government and teaching online safety. I think most definitely there is a dire need for a broader approach to online safety education. If I heard Andy correctly saying that it's not only the industry's responsibility to engage in this area, and there's multiple stakeholders here that need to be engaged more and need to do more, whether that's the government, whether that's the industry, whether that's the private sector, or any of them. So I do believe that that's an opportunity for all of us to get more involved in it, because online safety issues do not just impact the education sector, and they do not just impact children. They impact every person connected to the internet, and in the UK and most of the world, it's everybody. So everybody should have that responsibility and share that equally on their positions, but as well be engaged and just doing the work of educating themselves as well on online safety and having appropriate professionals to guide that. And I will just connect it to the end about that ICO appropriate just a little story that we had in Croatia when the school was being built and the school was finished. And then they asked children from 5 to 7 years old what they thought about the school, and they said it was brilliant if only they could see outside of the windows, because the bottom part of the windows was made for the upper classes, not for the lower classes in their part of the school. And just the simple ideas of having the sensors on the car not being too high, so they detect children on passing on the zebras, is also important parts of why a child-centric, not maybe always having a youth panel advising some of the private companies, but having that mindset of that children might stumble upon, even if your service is not meant on them, I think would prove valuable going forward in any business. That's only my opinion.
Okay. So we're coming towards the end. I will sum up in a moment. Every so often when you're doing a presentation, you get a question where it is so searching a question that my game over the years is to say to the individual, this is obviously one that you've thought a lot about, so before I reply to it, why don't you tell me your thoughts? I can't do that because our audience is on mute, but I've had an extremely searching question about how controllers manage data subject access requests from parents in relation to the data of their children, if it's where the parent is the one that is consenting on behalf. It is a monstrous area to look at. Plus, I think also one of the other areas we tend to have really thought about is if we're going to deal with permissions and so on appropriately when we are an ISS aiming at children, what do we do when the child is no longer a child? What happens? Do the way we deal with them differ when they get to 18? How long should we keep children's data after they are no longer children? There's actually a lot here. Part of the reason that we did this webinar through the Data Protection Network is we quite like identifying where there is not enough guidance sometimes. And as those of you who know us know, we did the first guidance on legitimate interests as an appropriate ground for processing. We're in the middle of doing guidance on what is data retention and how do you develop appropriate policy. We might well look further at this whole sector. We are very happy to receive any more questions that you may have for us. We do know that we will be sending out the link to the 360 because you've asked for that. As I say, the webinar will be recorded and available for download within the next few days. I really appreciate those that have sent questions in. My apologies to that last question on SARS, that it is so hard that I don't think I'm even going to ask my panelists to answer that one. But I do hope you would help me thanking Andy and Boris and Roberto and Debbie for joining us today. And we look forward to being with you on another occasion. Thanks. Bye-bye.